At 600 hours, on May 24, 1941, HMS Hood's fire control team achieved radar lock on the German battleship Bismarck at a range of 25,000 yards. Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, commanding the battlecruiser squadron from Hood's bridge, had maneuvered his flagship and the battleship Prince of Wales into an intercept position in the Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland. After 36 hours of searching, the home fleet had found Germany's newest battleship attempting to break out into the Atlantic. Holland ordered both British ships to increase speed to 28 knots and turn to close the range. His tactical plan was straightforward. Close rapidly to under 20,000 yards, where Hood's 15-inch guns would have maximum penetrating power against Bismarck's side armor. Maintain an angle of approach that minimized the British ships' exposure while maximizing their forward firepower. Destroy or cripple Bismarck before she could escape into the vastness of the Atlantic, where she would threaten every convoy bringing food, fuel, and munitions from America to Britain. The plan was sound. The ships were positioned correctly. The crews were trained and ready. In 3 minutes, Hood would open fire. In 8 minutes, she would be gone. Hood was not supposed to die quickly. She was the largest warship in the Royal Navy, 860 feet long, displacing 680 tons, fully loaded. Her main battery consisted of 8 15-inch Mark I guns in 4 twin turrets capable of hurling 920-pound armor-piercing shells to a maximum range of 29,000 yards. Her belt armor was 12 inches thick amidships, tapering to 5 inches at the bow and stern. Her deck armor ranged from 3 inches over the magazines to 1.5 inches over the machinery spaces. She had been the pride of the Royal Navy for 21 years, the largest capital ship in the world from 1920 until 1941, a symbol of British naval supremacy that had visited ports on 6 continents. Children in Britain learned her name before they learned the names of most members of Parliament. Foreign governments treated her arrival as a state visit. She was Hood, the mighty Hood, invincible, eternal, the ship that could not be sunk. The problem was that Hood was never designed to fight a modern battleship at long range. She was designed in 1916 to hunt down and destroy German battlecruisers in the North Sea at ranges under 16,000 yards. Every armor decision, every design compromise, every weight calculation was optimized for a type of combat that by 1941 no longer existed. And those compromises, made 25 years earlier by engineers who could not have predicted how naval warfare would evolve, were about to kill 1,415 men. The battlecruiser concept originated with Admiral Sir John Fisher, First Sea Lord of the Admiralty from 1904 to 1910, and again from 1914 to 1915. Fisher believed the future of naval warfare lay in speed and firepower, not armor. His vision was a warship armed like a battleship, but fast enough to catch any ship it could destroy, and fast enough to escape any ship that could destroy it. The formula was simple: battleship guns plus high speed equals battlecruiser. The first battlecruisers, HMS Invincible, Inflexible, and Indomitable, were laid down in 1906. They displaced 17,250 tons, mounted 8 12-inch guns, and could reach 25 knots. By comparison, contemporary battleships like HMS Dreadnought displaced 18,000 tons, mounted 10 12-inch guns, and could reach 21 knots. The battlecruisers sacrificed 2 guns and significant armor protection to gain 4 knots of speed. Fisher's doctrine was that battlecruisers would never fight battleships. They would hunt cruisers, destroy commerce raiders, and engage enemy battlecruisers. If they encountered a battleship, they would use their superior speed to disengage. The armor was sufficient to defeat cruiser guns, but not battleship guns. This was acceptable because battlecruisers would never be subjected to battleship gunfire. The doctrine was flawed from the beginning. In combat, admirals used battlecruisers however the tactical situation demanded. At the Battle of Jutland on May 31, 1916, British battlecruisers under Admiral Sir David Beatty encountered the German High Seas Fleet's battlecruiser squadron commanded by Admiral Franz Hipper. Beatty's 6 battlecruisers engaged Hipper's 5 battlecruisers at ranges between 14,000 and 18,500 yards. Within the first 30 minutes of combat, HMS Indefatigable exploded and sank with all but 2 of her 1,209-man crew. 18 minutes later, HMS Queen Mary exploded and sank with all but 9 of her 1,006-man crew. Both ships were destroyed by German shells that penetrated their thin deck armor, plunged into their magazines, and detonated their cordite propellant charges. The flash fire from the detonating propellant traveled through ammunition handling rooms and ignited hundreds of tons of cordite throughout the ship. The resulting explosion broke both ships in half. Later in the battle, HMS Invincible engaged German battleships at 9,000 yards. A German shell penetrated Invincible's midships turret, ignited the cordite inside, and the flash traveled down to the magazine. The magazine explosion broke Invincible in half. She sank in 90 seconds. 6 men survived out of a crew of 1,032. 3 battlecruisers lost at Jutland, all to magazine explosions caused by inadequate armor protection. The lesson was obvious. Battlecruisers needed better deck armor and better magazine protection. The Admiralty's response was to design a new class of battlecruisers that incorporated the lessons from Jutland. The result was HMS Hood. Hood was laid down at John Brown and Company's shipyard in Clydebank, Scotland, on September 1, 1916, 4 months after Jutland. The design had already been approved before Jutland, but after the battle the Admiralty ordered modifications to improve her protection. The original design called for 3-inch deck armor over the magazines. This was increased to 5 inches. The original design called for 6-inch belt armor amidships. This was increased to 12 inches. Additional armor was added to the turret's barbettes and conning tower. The total weight of added armor was approximately 5,000 tons. The modifications solved some problems but created others. The additional armor increased Hood's displacement from the original 36,300 tons to 46,680 tons fully loaded. The increased weight reduced her metacentric height, the measure of a ship's stability. To compensate, designers increased her beam from 104 feet to 105.25 feet and added anti-torpedo bulges along her sides. These modifications restored stability, but reduced her maximum speed from 32 knots to 31 knots. More critically, the additional armor was not distributed uniformly. Most of the extra weight went to vertical belt armor and turret protection. The deck armor over the machinery spaces remained at 1.5 to 2 inches. The reasoning was that Hood would fight at ranges under 16,000 yards, where enemy shells would strike at relatively flat trajectories, hitting the belt armor rather than plunging through the deck. At ranges beyond 20,000 yards, shells traveled in high arcs. They would plunge downward, striking the deck rather than the belt. At these ranges, Hood's deck armor was inadequate to stop heavy shells. The engineers understood this vulnerability. Design documents from 1916 and 1917 explicitly noted that Hood's deck armor was insufficient to protect against plunging fire at long range. The solution was tactical, not technological. Hood would close to under 16,000 yards before engaging enemy capital ships. At that range, her belt armor was sufficient, and her firepower was overwhelming. This doctrine was enshrined in Royal Navy tactical publications throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Battlecruisers were to close rapidly to medium range, use their speed to maintain optimal tactical position, and destroy the enemy with rapid, accurate fire before the enemy could exploit the battlecruiser's weakness in deck armor. The problem was that naval warfare changed faster than the Royal Navy's doctrine. By 1941, fire control technology had advanced dramatically. Optical rangefinders could accurately measure ranges beyond 30,000 yards. Mechanical fire control computers could calculate firing solutions accounting for range target speed, target course wind, air temperature, and barrel wear. Radar could track targets in darkness, fog, or smoke. Ships could engage each other at ranges where visual identification was difficult and hits were lethal. The optimal engagement range had increased from 16,000 yards in 1916 to 25,000 yards in 1941. At those ranges, shells fell nearly vertically. Deck armor was more important than belt armor, and Hood's deck armor had not been improved since 1918. The Royal Navy knew Hood was vulnerable. Multiple studies between 1919 and 1939 recommended modernizing her armor. The recommendations were detailed and specific. Add inches of deck armor over the magazines and machinery spaces. Improve underwater protection against torpedoes. Upgrade the anti-aircraft armament. Install modern fire control radars. The estimated cost was £3 million. The estimated time was 18 months. The work was never done. The reasons were financial and strategic. In 1919, Britain was exhausted from World War I. The government faced massive debts and demanded military spending cuts. The Royal Navy's budget was slashed. Modernizing Hood was unaffordable. Through the 1920s, the Washington Naval Treaty limited battleship construction. Britain needed to build new battleships to replace aging dreadnoughts. Modernizing Hood was less important than new construction. In the 1930s, international tensions increased. Germany was rearming. Japan was expanding in Asia. Italy was building a modern navy. Britain needed every capital ship operational. Taking Hood out of service for 18 months was strategically unacceptable. The modernization was postponed repeatedly. Each year, the Admiralty justified the delay with the same argument. Hood was still the most powerful ship in the fleet. Her guns were effective. Her speed was unmatched. The risk of magazine explosion was theoretical. She had served for 20 years without serious damage. The modernization could wait one more year. By 1938, war was imminent. The Admiralty finally approved Hood's modernization. She was scheduled to enter dry dock in early 1941 for a complete reconstruction that would have added 5,000 tons of deck armor, upgraded her anti-aircraft defenses, and installed modern radar and fire control systems. The work would have taken 24 months and transformed Hood into a modern capital ship capable of engaging any battleship in the world. War began on September 3, 1939. Hood's modernization was canceled. Britain needed every operational capital ship immediately. Hood could not be spared. She would have to fight with 1918 protection against 1941 weapons. The Admiralty calculated the risk was acceptable. Hood would operate with other capital ships. She would be protected by cruisers and destroyers. She would engage the enemy at medium range where her armor was adequate. The assumptions were optimistic. On May 24, 1941, Hood was not operating with other capital ships. She was accompanied by HMS Prince of Wales, a battleship so new she still had civilian contractors aboard working to complete her installations. Prince of Wales's main battery had persistent mechanical problems. Several of her 14-inch guns were out of action. Her crew was still training. She was barely combat ready. The two British ships were hunting Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen. Bismarck was Germany's newest battleship, commissioned in August 1940. She displaced 5,300 tons fully loaded, mounted 8 15-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, and had a maximum speed of 30 knots. Her belt armor was 12.6 inches thick. Her deck armor was 4.7 to 7.9 inches thick over the magazines and machinery spaces, and her underwater protection included an elaborate system of compartments designed to absorb torpedo hits. Bismarck was designed in the mid-1930s, incorporating lessons from World War I and advances in metallurgy, welding, and ship construction. She was a modern battleship optimized for long-range combat in the Atlantic. Her fire control system was excellent. Her armor distribution was comprehensive. She had no critical weaknesses. Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland understood the tactical problem. Hood's deck armor was vulnerable at long range. Prince of Wales was unreliable. The two British ships could not safely engage Bismarck beyond 20,000 yards. Holland's plan was to close rapidly, absorb whatever damage Bismarck could inflict during the approach, then destroy her at medium range where British firepower would be decisive. The risk was that Hood might be hit in the magazines during the approach. Holland accepted this risk because the alternative was to allow Bismarck to escape into the Atlantic. If Bismarck reached the convoy routes, she would sink dozens of merchant ships before the Royal Navy could corner her again. Thousands of British civilians and merchant seamen would die. Britain's supply lines from North America would be disrupted. The strategic cost of letting Bismarck escape was unacceptable. Holland had to engage immediately before Bismarck could break contact. At 05:35 hours, Holland had received a sighting report from the cruisers HMS Norfolk and Suffolk, which had been shadowing the German ships through the night. Bismarck and Prince Eugen were 300 miles ahead, steaming southwest at 28 knots. Holland calculated an intercept course and increased speed to 27 knots. His plan was to intercept the German ships at dawn in the Denmark Strait, where they would be silhouetted against the eastern sky, while Hood and Prince of Wales would be difficult to see against the dark western horizon. The geometry was perfect. At 05:35 hours, Hood was 50 miles from the projected intercept point. At 05:52 hours, lookouts aboard Hood sighted smoke on the horizon bearing 335 degrees. At 600 hours, Hood's fire control team identified two large ships at a range of 25,000 yards. Bismarck and Prince Eugen were where Holland expected them. The intercept had worked. Holland ordered both British ships to increase speed to 28 knots and turn to a heading of 280 degrees. This course would close the range while minimizing the British ship's exposure. Hood and Prince of Wales would approach bow on, presenting the smallest possible target while bringing their forward turrets to bear. The disadvantage of this approach was that only the forward turrets could fire. Hood's A and B turrets, 4 guns total. Prince of Wales's A and B turrets, 4 guns total. 8 guns firing versus Bismarck's 8 guns and Prince Eugen's 8 8-inch guns. The Germans had more guns in action during the approach phase. Holland accepted this because once the range closed to 16,000 yards, he intended to turn to run parallel to Bismarck, bringing all guns to bear. At that point, Hood would have 8 15-inch guns firing. Prince of Wales would have 10 14-inch guns firing overwhelming German firepower. At 05:52 hours, Holland ordered Hood to open fire at a range of 25,000 yards. The order was premature. At that range, Hood's shells would be falling at steep angles, exactly the scenario her armor was not designed for. But Holland wanted to force the German ships to maneuver defensively, disrupting their fire control solutions. Hood's forward turrets opened fire at 05:43 hours. 4 15-inch shells arced through the dawn sky toward the German formation. The shells took 23 seconds to reach the target. They missed, falling short by approximately 1,000 yards. Prince of Wales opened fire seconds after Hood. Her shells also missed. The range was extreme and both British ships were firing while maneuvering at high speed. Accuracy was poor. Aboard Bismarck, Admiral Gunther Lütjens and Captain Ernst Lindemann watched the shell splashes through their rangefinders. Lindemann ordered Bismarck's forward turrets to return fire. At 05:55 hours, Bismarck's Anton and Bruno turrets fired their first salvo. 8 15-inch shells weighing 1,764 pounds each crossed the distance in 21 seconds. The German fire control system was excellent. The first salvo straddled Hood with shells landing on both sides. Bismarck's fire control team had the range immediately. Prince Eugen also opened fire her 8-inch guns targeting Hood. The tactical situation was developing exactly as Holland had planned. Range was decreasing. British ships were approaching bow on, minimizing their target profile. In 8 minutes, Hood would turn to bring all her guns to bear. But the Germans were scoring hits. At 05:55 hours, a shell from Prince Eugen struck Hood's boat deck, detonated among the anti-aircraft ammunition stored there, and started a fire. The fire was visible from Prince of Wales 800 yards astern of Hood. Black smoke poured from Hood's deck. Damage control parties responded immediately, but the fire continued to burn. At 0600 hours, Hood fired her 4th salvo. Bismarck fired her 3rd salvo. The range was now 22,000 yards and decreasing rapidly. Holland ordered Hood to turn 20 degrees to port to bring his after turrets into action. The turn would expose Hood's broadside briefly before settling on a parallel course to Bismarck. It was the correct tactical decision at the wrong moment. As Hood began her turn, Bismarck's 5th salvo was already in the air. 4 15-inch shells descended on Hood. One shell struck the deck between Hood's mainmast and X-turret, her aftmost turret. The shell penetrated the deck armor, which at that location was approximately 2 inches thick. The shell continued through the upper deck, through the main deck, through the lower deck, and into the after magazine serving X and Y turrets. The magazine contained 112 tons of cordite propellant stored in silk bags. The shell detonated inside the magazine. The cordite exploded instantaneously. The explosion generated a pressure wave that ruptured every bulkhead in the after section of the ship. The force of the blast blew Hood's after turrets completely off the ship. The explosion traveled forward through handling rooms and passages, igniting more cordite in the magazine serving the midships turrets. Within 3 seconds, the entire after section of Hood from the mainmast to the stern was consumed by a fireball that erupted through the deck and sides of the ship. Men aboard Prince of Wales saw a massive orange explosion blow through Hood's deck. The explosion lifted Hood's stern out of the water. Her bow rose briefly, then the entire ship broke in half at the mainmast. The forward section from the bow to the mainmast remained intact for several seconds. Men could be seen on the bridge and forward turrets. Then the forward section rolled to port and sank bow first. The after section, already destroyed by the magazine explosion, disappeared in seconds. From the moment the shell struck to the moment Hood vanished beneath the surface was approximately 90 seconds. At 06:01 hours, Hood ceased to exist. Of her crew of 418 men, 3 survived. They were blown off the deck by the explosion and survived in the water until rescued hours later by British destroyers. One was ordinary signalman Ted Briggs, age 18, who had been on the bridge when the explosion occurred. He was thrown into the water, pulled under as the ship sank, then pushed back to the surface by some updraft from the sinking hull. He survived with minor injuries. Another survivor was able seaman Bob Tilburn, age 20, who had been in a gun position on the forward deck. The explosion threw him overboard. He surfaced, inflated his life jacket, and floated for 3 hours before being rescued. The third survivor was Midshipman William Dundas, age 19. He remembered the explosion being thrown into the water and swimming away from the ship as she sank. All 3 survivors reported the same sequence. A massive explosion, aft the ship breaking in half, immediate sinking. None of them saw Hood's magazines gradually catch fire or any progressive flooding. The magazine detonation was instantaneous and catastrophic. Aboard Prince of Wales, Captain John Leach watched Hood disappear and immediately realized he was now alone facing 2 German capital ships. Prince of Wales was already taking hits from Bismarck. Several of her main battery guns were malfunctioning due to mechanical problems. Leach ordered Prince of Wales to turn away and make smoke. Breaking contact was the only rational decision. Continuing the engagement would result in Prince of Wales being sunk as well. The loss of Hood was a strategic disaster for Britain. She was the most famous ship in the Royal Navy, the symbol of British naval power. Her destruction in less than 2 minutes by a ship that had been operational for only 9 months shattered the myth of British invincibility. The psychological impact on British morale was profound. Churchill was informed of Hood's loss while meeting with military advisors. He reportedly said nothing for several minutes, then ordered the Admiralty to sink Bismarck at all costs. The Royal Navy committed every available ship to hunting Bismarck. Within 72 hours, Bismarck was located crippled by torpedo bombers from the carrier HMS Ark Royal and sunk by gunfire from the battleships HMS King George V and HMS Rodney. Of Bismarck's crew of 2,201 men, 114 survived. The destruction of both Hood and Bismarck within 3 days demonstrated that battleships and battlecruisers had become obsolete. They could be destroyed by single hits from modern weapons. Their construction costs were enormous, their operational effectiveness limited, and their vulnerability had become unacceptable. The British Board of Inquiry into Hood's loss convened on June 2, 1941. The inquiry examined testimony from the 3 survivors' damage reports from other ships, present analysis of Bismarck's firing patterns, and technical studies of Hood's armor protection. The inquiry concluded that Hood was destroyed by a shell that penetrated her deck armor and detonated in or near the after magazines. The inquiry identified the cause of the penetration as inadequate deck armor over the magazines. The inquiry noted that Hood's deck armor had been recognized as insufficient since 1918 and that multiple recommendations to improve it had been rejected for financial and strategic reasons. The inquiry's final report stated that Hood was lost due to design compromises made 25 years earlier that were never corrected despite repeated warnings. The report was classified. Its findings were not made public until 1959. The Royal Navy did not want to acknowledge that one of its capital ships had been sent into combat with known fatal weaknesses. The technical analysis of Hood's armor after her loss revealed the specific vulnerability. Hood's deck armor over the after magazines was 3 inches of non-cemented armor. At 22,000 yards range, Bismarck's 15-inch shells impacted at approximately 20 degrees from vertical. At that angle, a 764-pound armor-piercing shell would penetrate 3 inches of deck armor and retain sufficient velocity to detonate inside the magazine. If Hood's deck armor had been 5 inches thick, as originally recommended, after Jutland, the shell would have been defeated or would have detonated before reaching the magazine. The difference between survival and destruction was 2 inches of steel plating. The cost to add that armor in 1918 would have been approximately £200,000. The cost of losing Hood in 1941 was 415 lives and the symbolic heart of British naval power. Modern analysis using computer simulations has confirmed the Board of Inquiry's conclusions. Hood's armor distribution made her vulnerable to plunging fire at ranges beyond 20,000 yards. Her belt armor was excellent, her turret armor was excellent, but her deck armor was inadequate. In the tactical situation of May 24, 1941, Hood was required to approach Bismarck from 25,000 yards to 16,000 yards while exposed to plunging fire for approximately 8 minutes. The probability of a magazine hit during that period was approximately 15 to 20% depending on German accuracy. Hood was unlucky that the hit occurred during the approach rather than after she had closed to medium range, but the vulnerability was inherent in her design. Eventually, she would have encountered a situation where her deck armor was tested. On May 24, 1941, she failed that test. The wreck of Hood was located in July 2001 by an expedition led by David Mearns using deep-water sonar. The wreck lies in 334 feet of water in the Denmark Strait, approximately 500 yards from where she sank. The wreck is in 3 major sections. The bow section from the stem to the bridge is relatively intact, lying on its side. The midship section from the bridge to the mainmast is heavily damaged and partially collapsed. The after section from the mainmast to the stern is completely destroyed. The location and condition of the wreck confirm that the fatal explosion occurred in the after magazines. The bow and midship sections show no evidence of catastrophic explosion. The after section is fragmented into pieces no larger than 20 feet across. The explosion that destroyed Hood's after magazines was so powerful it obliterated the entire after third of the ship. Video footage from remotely operated vehicles showed the collapsed remains of X and Y turrets, portions of the stern structure and debris scattered over hundreds of yards. The wreck is designated a war grave. British law prohibits diving on or disturbing the site. In 2012, the British Ministry of Defence placed a white ensign, the Royal Navy's flag, on the wreck during a memorial expedition. The flag was placed by ROV on the bow section, symbolically recommissioning Hood as an active unit of the Royal Navy. The 3 survivors of Hood maintained contact throughout their lives. Ted Briggs became the primary keeper of Hood's memory. He attended memorial services, gave interviews, wrote books, and ensured that the 1,415 men who died were not forgotten. Briggs died on October 4, 2008 at age 85. He was the last survivor. Bob Tilburn died on November 10, 1995 at age 74. William Dundas died on January 14, 1965 at age 43. With their deaths, no one who served aboard Hood remains alive. The lesson of Hood's loss is that design compromises made for sound reasons at one point in time can become fatal vulnerabilities when circumstances change. Hood was designed for combat at ranges under 16,000 yards against battlecruisers. She was forced to fight at 22,000 yards against a modern battleship. The doctrine that was supposed to protect her close rapidly to medium range exposed her to exactly the threat she could not survive. The institutional failure was the Navy's decision to defer modernization for 20 years, despite repeated warnings that Hood was vulnerable. Financial pressures, strategic priorities, and bureaucratic inertia combined to ensure that necessary work was never done. The result was predictable. Hood was sent into combat with 1918 protection against 1941 weapons. She lasted 8 minutes. The fatal flaw was not that Hood was poorly designed. For the tactical environment of 1916, her design was excellent. The fatal flaw was that naval warfare evolved and Hood did not. The shell that killed her was fired from a range that would have been inconceivable in 1916. It struck at an angle that her designers never anticipated. It exploited a weakness that the Royal Navy had identified in 1916 and failed to correct for 25 years. Hood's destruction demonstrated that in modern warfare there is no such thing as invincibility. No amount of size, power, or reputation protects a ship with fundamental design flaws. The Denmark Strait on May 24, 1941 was not a battle between navies. It was a technical evaluation. Hood's 1918 armor was tested against Bismarck's 1940 firepower. The armor failed. 1,400 men died because of decisions made decades earlier by people who never imagined the world their ship would have to fight in.